Hello, welcome. I'm Dr. Ross Thompson of the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Davis, and we're here to talk about the social interaction strand of the social-emotional development domain, especially as it relates to transitional kindergarten. You know, social interaction involves a whole network of skills that are developing enormously rapidly during the transitional kindergarten year. Children are learning to do things and to be things and to interact with other children and adults in ways that they have not done so before, and that in many respects lay the foundation for their ability to successfully engage with other people in group learning as they move into the primary grades. Just as an example of that, consider all the variety of ways that children are developing social and emotional skills during the transitional kindergarten period. They are learning to become a member, for example, of a classroom learning community, including participating in group decision-making and sharing responsibility for those decisions and for enacting them. That's a new experience for them. They are recognizing and comparing and respecting different viewpoints and feelings. They've been encouraged to do so early on, but now they're developing the cognitive abilities to be able to switch focus from their own feelings to other people's feelings in a much more flexible way. This is a new experience for them. In transitional kindergarten, children are also understanding and cooperating with group expectations. They are learning what it means to be a classroom citizen and what are the roles and expectations that are required of them. And they're understanding that those expectations are required of others as well, so they're also learning to monitor others' cooperation. So when children turn into tattletales, for example, you'll understand that this is reflecting an advance in their understanding of rules and how they apply to all of us. Children, of course, are learning skills for managing conflict and for resolving that conflict with others. And they're learning more sophisticated strategies than they knew earlier, and as a result are coming up with more creative and inventive ways of getting beyond having conflict be an obstacle to social participation. They're developing a sense of fairness and respect for other people and are on the vanguard of beginning to identify what is unfair without it being prompted by somebody else, to see what is unfair because they have a general sense of what fairness is. They are developing pride in an identity as a cooperative group member. They are beginning to take on for themselves the idea of being a good member of the group as part of what they take pride in being. And they're understanding that other practices and customs might be unfamiliar, but they are not bad for that reason. That differences do not mean that one is good and the other is bad, but that differences can be accepted. And this is new for kids in transitional kindergarten. Now, it's important to recognize that these kinds of social and emotional skills are ones that can be taught by a transitional kindergarten teacher, just like cognitive skills, but not in the same way that cognitive skills are taught. Transitional kindergarten teachers can be intentional in their efforts to foster the development of social competence and emotional understanding for kids of this age. So what are the intentional strategies that transitional kindergarten teachers can use to try to build children's social competence, their emotional understanding, and their classroom citizenship? Well, one thing they can do is simply to know their children well, to understand their individuality, their supports and stresses, their strengths and challenges, and in so knowing them well, to be able to understand and respond to them as individuals. One way this can be accomplished is to talk with them regularly about their experiences in a way that they have not been capable of beforehand. Children in the transitional kindergarten year are interested in talking about the things that have happened to them, the things that have captured their interest, and having a teacher unfold that for them. In addition, connecting with their families can be a fantastic way of understanding this child better by knowing the background and the people that they have come from. In addition, a transitional kindergarten teacher can use class meetings to discuss problems, to encourage children's ideas about solutions, to model respect for different viewpoints, encourage groups' consensus. There is much, much more that can be done in classroom meetings and circle time and other group discussions to help children develop an appreciation of the diversity of points of view, but also have respect for those different points of view, to contribute one's own voice, but also to understand how these different points of view can be harmonized. And children are really at the beginning of being able to engage in that process in a serious way. Everybody has the experience that it's time for the classroom to be cleaned up, maybe singing the cleanup song and discovering one child who is not participating and claims that this was not a mess that he made, so why should he have to clean it up? And this is where helping children understand that this is our classroom and that it is our activity together that makes all of us responsible as individual classroom citizens for our shared experience. To help children think about themselves in this way is part of what the transitional kindergarten experience can be for them. And then to use the diversity of the classroom, the diversity in family background, culture, language, ethnicity, to help children understand that different practices have their own value. Recognizing that, like all of us, children prefer practices and languages and foods and traditions that are consistent with their own experience. They're like all the rest of us in that respect. But that what transitional kindergarten can begin helping them understand is that difference does not need to be worse, that different kinds of practices, backgrounds, traditions can be valuable for other people as well, and therefore respected in that way. To use storybooks, puppet play, and pretend play to explore social interaction and strengthen children's emotional understanding is another intentional way that transitional kindergarten teachers can help foster this social competence for children. And then finally, to model and sportscast your own cooperative social behavior. To not only do what you do as a model to children, but to talk about why you're doing it. To provide, for example, art materials for a child who has arrived late, who wants to draw, and then to be able to say, because we want Janie to have an opportunity to draw as well, can be one way of helping children understand not only what you're doing, but also why you're doing it. Now, there are two other things to add to these strategies that are really important. And one is expressed in the words of a wise friend of mine who said, where children are concerned, it's not just what you do, it's how you are with them. And so, perhaps one of the most important things that a teacher does is to convey implicitly to a child in their actions, in their demeanor, in how they are with a child, that you are valued, that you are respected, that what you say matters, you are heard, and that will always be so. So it is how you are that's also important. And the second thing I would add to this is also pointing out that it's not just in what we do, but it's also in how we design our classroom environment that we can also contribute to constructive social behavior in the children in that classroom. To have a space that is carefully designed, for example, with different areas suited for different activities, a large area for large-scale play or group activity or block building, but also a small out-of-the-way area with pillows and books and storybooks for children to be able to get away if they need to from the rest of the group, to reconstitute, to be able to have a quiet time. To have space that is well suited for small group activity and also individual activity. To make materials available to children at a child's level where they can access them readily and have enough materials so that children are not always in conflict over competition for valued resources or toys. That in this way, by strategically designing our classroom environment, we can also proactively help to contribute to the kind of constructive social behavior that makes that classroom environment a productive one for children. Now, we've been talking about children's constructive social behavior, but I want to turn to something that is a concern or a worry to some transitional kindergarten teachers. And this has to do with children's peer relationships, and particularly what to do when there are problems emerging in children's interactions with other children, where bullying can occur, or where a child becomes ostracized or excluded by many other children. This brings us into a topic of study that developmental researchers have been interested in for so many years because of its importance to children's social competence and their ability to succeed in a classroom. Because after all, a classroom is a social environment where children seek to be accepted. And as a result of a lot of their research, they have identified ways of trying to measure how children are standing in relation to other kids in the group. One of the most widely used methods is also one of the simplest ones. And this asks children to nominate from among the group of peers in their classroom or their group 3 kids that they most like to be with and 3 kids that they don't like to be with very much. And on the basis of those classroom nominations, researchers have constructed a number of different peer status categories that help to identify how a child is standing in relation to other kids in the classroom. Let me identify these classroom categories, these peer status categories for you, because I think you'll be able to identify where some, perhaps a few of the kids in your class may be falling out. There are, for example, those children who are readily identified as popular among their peers. They have many positive nominations. Lots of kids are saying, I like to be with this kid, and very few negative nominations. But sometimes we don't recognize that there can be another category, somewhat similar but different, that are called controversial children. And these are the ones with many positive peer nominations, but also many negative peer nominations. So the name fits. These are controversial kids because they're liked by some, but they're disliked by other peers. Guess who tend to be classroom leaders? It often turns out to be the controversial kids. There are the neglected kids. Few positive nominations, few negative nominations. These are the ones who tend to be at the periphery of the classroom social landscape. Years ago, developmental researchers used to be concerned about those neglected kids. In a society like ours where it's really important to fit in, there was a worry that these neglected kids were losing out and would be victims of feeling lonely or excluded as a result. And what they've learned in the years since that time in doing more and more research is that oftentimes neglected kids are not suffering from loneliness. They are at the margins of the social group because that is where they prefer to be. And consistent with their own temperament and social style, this does seem to be a social status that fits well for them, at least at this time. Of greater concern are those kids who are rejected for their aggressive behavior. Few positive nominations, lots of negative nominations, and the reason for the negative nominations is because children are distinguished by their aggressive conduct in relation to other kids. These are the ones we are concerned about because children who are embarking on a trajectory of aggressive behavior this young are not likely to do well as they move through the primary grades. There's another group of rejected kids that we also are concerned about. These are the ones who are rejected because of their withdrawn or submissive behavior. Lots of negative nominations, but in this case, it's because of their shy, they're hesitant, or at times just their socially awkward or inept behavior. And these too are kids that we want to devote some helpful attention to, because this too is a trajectory that can be maintained as children move through the primary grade years. And then finally, kids who don't fall into any of these other categories, probably like me in those days, would be the average kids, everybody else. Now, identifying these does not mean that we compartmentalize the children in our transitional kindergarten classroom, but it does give us some vocabulary with which to understand some of the children that are evoking our concern because of some of their peer relational difficulties, and leads naturally to the question of how can we help prevent peer problems. And I want to suggest in answering this question that there are two different kinds of strategies that we can use. There are both proactive strategies that have a preventive cast, but there are also efforts that we can do to manage conflict, reactive if you will, managing conflict when it does occur. So to begin, with proactive strategies, one thing the teachers can do is to simply create cooperative activities, opportunities for children to work together in a positive sense, especially when these are children who don't normally interact with each other. Some transitional kindergarten teachers will very deliberately seek to put together kids who do not naturally congregate with each other in order to develop skills and to develop partnerships that might not otherwise develop. In addition, we can take the opportunity when conflict is not occur to talk about conflict resolution strategies. Outside of the heat of the conflict, children can be in a better position to think about and begin to understand different modes of alternative dispute resolution that they can then hopefully enlist when conflict does occur, such as negotiation, compromise, turn-taking, and other cooperative strategies. And then finally, to coach children who have peer difficulties with more socially constructive ways of interacting with other people. To help a child who is shy or awkward to watch other kids who are interacting more successfully with others, and perhaps to pick up some ideas about how that child can begin to enter the social group more adaptively and more successfully. Of course, conflict does occur. And another way in which teachers can help promote a constructive social environment in the classroom are strategies for managing conflict when it does occur. This can involve primarily using descriptive language to help children understand another's perspective. Remember that children of this age, especially when they're emotionally aroused, often lack cognitive flexibility to be able to turn away from how the situation looks to them and to understand how it looks to the other child. And so a teacher needs to be there to help put words to that other child's perspective, to help them understand how another child's emotions and desires and goals may conflict with a child's own but be perfectly reasonable. And then to put that in the context of the whys of fairness and mutual respect. To also encourage children to work out their disagreements. At age 5, they are ready to begin engaging in simple conflict negotiation strategies, but to also be prepared to coach them in conflict resolution when they do need to turn to a teacher. And in that coaching, to help them begin thinking of different strategies that may not have occurred to them. The transitional kindergarten year is a fantastic time for children developing skills of social interaction and emotion understanding like no other year. And I hope this conversation has been helpful to you in thinking about some of the things that you can do in a transitional kindergarten classroom. Thank you for being with me.